So hi everyone, my name is Nicole McNeely. I am Impact Advisor at Europeana Foundation, and I'm delighted to be here hosting this discussion about collecting diversity data for audiences and professionals in the cultural heritage sector in Europe. We are joined by Deborah Williams, Executive Director of the Creative Diversity Network in the UK, and Magdalene, Advocacy Author from the European Network Against Racism. Super glad to have you both here, so thank you. This roundtable has been organised by myself and other colleagues in Europeana Foundation's Diversity and Inclusion Cross Team. We're also taking an impact perspective to this discussion. So it's been a collaboration. I'm super happy that Marika Efforts, the co-driver behind the Diversity and Inclusion Cross Team, is also here to help share information throughout the session in the chat. And I'd finally like to do my last thanks to say thank you for everyone for joining us and for everyone who might listen to this at a later date. For everyone who's here today, please do let us know in the chat who you are, where you're joining from, and what you'd like to get out of today's session. And thank you for filling in the registration data too. We have some questions collected from you, and we'll also be covering those today. So the topic of collecting diversity data is really important. I can say personally from my own side, I come from Northern Ireland and we have our own conflict heritage, I don't know how else to say it, but we have our own conflict baggage, and actually collecting data on diversity collecting data has really helped us get past a lot of issues to an extent. So I've seen why this can really help in context. I've also worked with in the UK in Arts Council England, and I've seen how collecting data on diversity can be used for really good purposes to really improve the access to and provision of resources for cultural engagement and funding. So really, really happy to have us all here today. And the thing about data is that without data, we can't really know what the problems are in terms of representation. And thinking about heritage, we're thinking about representation in terms of our audiences and our professional networks. And without the data, we can't fix the problems or track the progress we're making to help address the problems. So, data is super important. And we see today as the start of a conversation about diversity data. And for Europeana, this is really great timing. We work on a pan-European level, and over the last years, we've been asking ourselves, what does diversity look like beyond representation across EU member states? How can we be more inclusive? Where are the gaps in representation in digital cultural heritage? And this is not just a tick box exercise. Without knowing which professionals are represented in the cultural heritage sector and which aren't, we can't address the bigger questions and problems of representation in the narratives that we share, in the collections that we protect, preserve, nurture, and grow. So representation has implications for the quality and the accuracy of our digital heritage data and for our exhibitions. It has implications for the reuse of our heritage data, and has implications, of course, for the audiences whom we might unconsciously exclude or include. And so to address this topic, we'll be thinking both about professionals who work in heritage, as well as the audiences that ultimately benefit from their work. So before we get onto these big topics, I'd like to remind you that we ask all participants today to join us in helping to create a safe, inclusive, and respectful online space during this discussion. To put it really simply, please be open and please be kind. And Marika will share more about our inclusive conversation and community guidelines in the chat, so please take a read of those. And if you have any concerns, you can contact Marika or I directly. Any concerns about what you hear or see during the session, please do contact Marika or I directly. And if you have specific questions about the topic we're discussing, please use the Q&A function so we can come back to those. So I think I've been talking enough. So I'd really like, and I should say that I'd like to keep the tone of this event quite informal, but I think that will help us come to a very fruitful and frank discussion, and one that I hope is very useful for everyone who's listening. And so first, I'd like to ask our participants to introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off the discussion. I'd like to ask Deborah to go first, and then followed by Magda. So over to you.
How much of an introduction do you want? Just my name and who I am, and a little bit?
Yep.
Okay.
That'll do.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Deborah Williams. As Nicole said, I'm the Executive Director at the Creative Diversity Network in London, in the UK. I've been here now 5 years and 4 days. And what we do is essentially we are a membership organisation. We are a membership organisation for the UK broadcasters. So we cover, we work with all of the main broadcasters in the UK to look at collecting data on the demographics of who makes television and who's on television in the UK, and how people perceive themselves, so how they see themselves represented on screen. We manage a system called Diamond, which is just an ongoing, the first in the world, ongoing data collection platform that is electronic, and on an annual basis we report on the demographics, looking at it from a perspective of equality within legislation. So we have the Equality Act that we use as our baseline, along with our census data as the sort of barometer for what we're aiming for around race, gender, sex, sexual identity, sexual orientation, disability. So that's it for now, I think. Well, my background is as an actor and a writer and a performer. I come from theatre. I've worked at the Arts Council. I've worked at I designed the BFI diversity standards that are being used all around the world now. Unfortunately, I couldn't copyright them and IP them because I was working for the BFI at the time, but it's okay. That's all good. And then I've been doing this work now for 5 years. So I think that's more than enough from me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Deborah. I think your impact lives on through openly sourced guidelines, or openly available guidelines. So thank you for that. Magda, over to you.
Thank you, Nicole, for organizing this event and inviting me to participate in this webinar. As you said, my name is Magda Sarabugabisa, and I work at the European Network Against Racism as an advocacy officer in charge of employment and DEI. ENAR is also a member organization that advocates for data to be commonly used as a tool to measure discrimination, with our end goal being to ensure that European member states collect comparable sets of equality data in respects with fundamental rights and data protection standards. This is done so that they can plan inclusive public policies and monitor their implementation. In addition to advocating for EU member states to collect data, we advocate for comprehensive legal frameworks to be adopted that facilitate the collection of equality data by different actors of society, not only the state. Part of my work with ENAR includes managing our Equal at Work platform, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative where we partner with the private sector and help them in their equality data endeavor. I must say that they're still at the early stages of collecting data, so really trying to assess what the situation around this is and how they can have an impact on it.
Super, thanks so much. And I think in both of your introductions, you've already brought up a few questions or a few topics that we're going to cover throughout the discussion today, around data protection, around policy implementation, around sharing best practice and good practice about following the rules and also making a change. So first of all, I'd like to start off with the discussion of, in your words, what is equality data? What is diversity data, and why do we need to collect it? And then what do we do with it? So maybe I'll hand over to Deborah first.
I guess that, well, there are two ways of looking at it. One is the sort of legal and sort of GDPR compliant version, which is its personal data and sensitive data that can identify any individual. In terms of legislation here in the UK, like I said before, it is around your age, your sexual orientation, your sex, your gender, your disability, your marital status, your religious beliefs, and religion. But it also covers things like mental health. It covers people like being deaf or visually impaired and blind, etc. So it can go quite deep. Essentially, what to me it is, and the way that I like to work with it in the real world, so all of that's legal and that's great, and I use that language when it needs to be. In the real world, it is about, it's information that allows, that identifies an individual within any or multiple groups within which they exist, at the same time allows others, i.e. those collecting, to get a better understanding of who they are engaging with and who their services are coming into contact with and serving. So in terms of professionals, it's about who are you employing, who are you working with, who do who are you bringing into your business and bringing into your employment or contracting. And in terms of audiences, it's who do you reach, how do you reach them, and in what way. What way in particular is about, it's on whose terms. So, do they come to you or do you go to them? So is it, is it a two-way street, or is it push or pull? And why it's important, I think you said at the beginning, the magic moment for me was when I was at the Arts Council and I went to an event, a deeply inaccessible event. I had to climb 5 flights of stairs, which for me is climbing Everest, because my lungs don't have that capacity. So it took me like 20 minutes to climb 5 flights of stairs to get to this into this gallery where there was a conversation about, and it was just about women and data. And I didn't really know that was about. I thought it was about something else. And then when I got there, I realized that's what it was about. And I was like, no, it was about women and technology. And then when I got there, I met people talking about data and why data was important. And the scale sort of fell from my eyes a little bit. And I got introduced to a woman who works for an organization who were looking at data, but looking at data as culture. So thinking about this culture and the cultural offer from a data perspective. I went to the first exhibition and that was it. I was sold. And I understood then what the gap was in my knowledge in terms of the work that I've been doing as a practitioner and the work that I've been doing at the Arts Council around diversity. The two came together, and it was, if you don't know who you're employing, if you don't know who you're coming into access to and communication with, then your services are not relevant. So the main idea, the reason for me for why you do it is to ensure that what you are offering in the cultural heritage, creative space is relevant to the people you want to engage with it and the people you want to engage to do it. And that for me became the sort of foundation of the work that I then went on to do, at the Arts Council, which was about getting them to actually start thinking about collecting data, the standards of BFI and the work I'm doing now. It really is about relevance and making sure you're relevant.
And I think this concept, Magda, I'm going to hand over to you. I think this concept of relevance is really important, because I think in some there's still a perception that we're just doing this as a tick boxing exercise, but no, actually this data has value for what we do and how you bring it to people, and in terms of the quality that you're going to, the stories you're going to tell, the interaction people are going to, the responses people will have with what you're working on. So absolutely, I think pushing that perspective of quality, this relevance is super important. And Magda, over to you. The question again was, what is equality diversity data?
Yeah, I think Deborah explained what is equality data very well, so I won't get into that. I can explain a bit the ways that we can collect data. It can be done by very many different means, such as surveys, census, administrative processes, complaints data, or research. And why do we need to collect it? Equality data collection is the first step in addressing discriminations racialized groups are facing. What I mean by that is that if we're not counted, we don't really count. And without measuring and quantifying the extent of discriminations and inequalities in Europe, it becomes very, very difficult to tackle them effectively. Without data, there are no policies. That means that accurate and comparable data is essential in enabling policymakers and the public to access the scale and nature of discriminations suffered by vulnerable and marginalized people. It allows policymakers to better design, adapt, and evaluate policies. Data in itself is not really a cure to structural racism and discriminations. It's a tool to be used while focusing on developing meaningful actions at all levels. Another aspect of why equality data is so important is that it conscientizes the experiences of individuals who are affected by these racial discriminations, of the fact that what they're experiencing is not an individual issue, but it's the expression of a bigger structural issue in European society.
I think what you just expressed there is absolutely relevant. So, for example, Deborah, I think you mentioned also the census data as well, and having baselines to track your activities against. And there are comparable data sets there where you can sort of track your own progress. But until you're collecting data on your own work, you're not actually able to measure how you're standing up against this broader sort of representation. But also, Magda, you mentioned something which I think to some people might feel quite uncomfortable with, this idea of collecting data. And there's I've sort of experienced some of this in our own sort of work here. The diversity data has to be collected, but people might feel very sort of vulnerable about sharing this data. Both of you introduced the concept of data being able to identify who you are, whether it's as a member of one group or several groups, depending on what data is being collected. What are the sort of principles of gathering equality data that we have to bear in mind, first of all, when we set out? I'm thinking here, ethics, relationships with those you're collecting data from, things like that. Maybe Magda, can I hand over to you first for this one?
Some of the principles that we should follow when collecting data are human rights principles, really basics, of not doing harm. This means that the collection of data should not create and reinforce existing discriminations, bias, or stereotypes, and that the data should be collected to be used for the benefits of the groups they describe and society as a whole. Stemming from this principle of doing no harm, there are other principles that are fundamental to collecting data, such as the freedom to self-identify. This means that the person taking the survey or participating in the census should have the right to self-declare their intersecting identities, but should not be obliged to. Responding to the survey should remain voluntary. This goes in line with the self-identification principles, meaning that people can choose to respond, but they can also choose to opt out of the answers. When collecting data, the person that is trying to collect it should obtain the informed consent of data collection subjects, and this should remain a guiding principles. Another principle that is really important in the aspect is participation and consultation of the people you're trying to collect data from. And finally, another really important one that a lot of misconceptions exist around it is compliance with the legal framework in the country and also in the with the European regulations.
Yeah. This came up in some of the participants, people who are listening today, raised this, compliance with their legal frameworks in their own country, because of course we have a bit of a patchwork across Europe. We have different cultures towards equality data. Again, I'm coming from a context where for my very first job when I was like 15, or 16, I can't remember what the legal age to work is anymore, but when I was very young, I had to tell them what my religion was when I applied for my job. For me, this is normal to collect equality data, but I now live in the Netherlands with its obvious history as in the Second World War, and collecting data that can identify you by religion, by anything like this, is really not comfortable. People don't like this. So the legal framework reflects this in each country, and I think this is where people's concerns come from. They don't know how to move forward. But as you're saying, like I think you'll say more about later, there's guidance. You'll be able to share guidance on actually how you can do this. One question we have as Europeana is how we do this as a pan-European network. How we, what does diversity look like at a European level beyond identities or what your passport says, or passports say. And Deborah, do you have any thoughts then on this? This maybe what Magda mentioned about participation and consultation, because I know you've worked really closely with the big broadcasters in the UK to develop those relationships, and then also with the wider sector to, at least this is what I see from your work, that there's a lot of conversations happening around data collection. It's not just as simple as making the survey, or as Magda mentioned, there's different ways of collecting data. There's a lot more behind this to actually do this right. So can you maybe tell us a bit more about that?
The word for me is absolutely everything Magda said, but there's a compassion that is also required, and an empathy that is also required in understanding, everything that you've discussed in terms of regional variations, a European history that is incredibly challenging when you're talking about diversity and data collection, and just the idea of making lists around religions and ethnic grouping is, the minute you think about that in the European context, it becomes something obviously that's quite challenging. But the other word for me is transparency. There is one, the issue about data collection, diversity data collection, sensitive data collection, is always about what you're going to do with it. And I think historically, people have collected data and done nothing with it, and B, not told people what they're going to do with it. So you end up in a very strange place where you're deeply vulnerable, and you don't know who to talk to about it. So what I do, and what the work that we do, is always to let people know what we're doing with the data, and that is as simple as, the methodology. What is the methodology? What is the purpose? What is what are the research questions that you're seeking to answer? For our project, for the current project, for Diamond, that's quite easy to do. With things like the diversity standards, what that's about is, and actually the work at the Arts Council, it's the big thing that all of that work is about culture change and shifting the culture of the creative industries and the cultural sectors to being far more understanding around how diversity impacts the creation of work and the presentation and representation within the work that is seen by audiences. So it is always about being transparent and letting people know what you're doing with the data, almost like a running commentary or at least a timeline or a time frame. That's why we publish our data on an annual basis. From this date to this date, we're collecting data, and within 4 months after the data's been collected, we're publishing the data, and we're offering some analysis and some insights around what we're seeing within the data, and then positing some recommendations around what we think the next step should be in order to elicit change, or to embed some of the good practice that we found, or deeper diving into elements of the data that we think require a little more time to think and consider. So that for me is also quite rather critical. And we operate in terms of the individual. Just the last thing to say, we collect data that is aggregated and anonymized. So the anonymity of the individual is critical, and it needs to be secure, and you need to make sure that nobody can access it. So that's why we are confident in what we're doing, and I'm confident in what we're doing, that it is aggregated data, it is anonymous data. And as Magda said, if you ever want to your data removed from that collection, we find a way to do it. It's complex. A SAR request is incredibly complex in an aggregated, anonymized system, but there are ways of doing that, tracking data through. But it's not, you only know it's the individual when the individual tells you that you have their data. You never know who has or has not filled in a form. And I prefer not to say, they're always not allowing people to opt out, keep it voluntary is also critical, because it's stuff about yourself, right? It is stuff about you and who you are. And in some ways, like yourself, I've always had to identify. And for most people, the minute I walk into a room, people go, ah, ha, ha. And it's quite easy for people to spot. There are a couple of things that might put me into the diversity space. A couple of things about me externally that might put me into the diversity space in other people's perspectives. But how I identify, that's something else, and that's something personal. So keeping it aggregated, keeping it anonymous, keeping it voluntary, keeping it transparent, engaging in conversations, all feeds the idea that this is a part of culture that is critical, not something that is mandated and municipal.
Yeah, which I think is a really important point, and also brings up some comments left, or some questions and points left by people who signed up for today. which was that in some cases you don't have to, well, in most cases you don't, for example, in the heritage sector, we don't have to collect this data. We're not mandated to do so. And so there's a question I'd like to maybe put to Magda in terms of your work with other corporate organizations and organizations maybe going through this change in terms of, or I'd say change, embracing collecting equality data. How do you, the question from one of the participants was, how do you start institutional change? And I'll also contextualize this within a definition of digital transformation that we also published earlier this year, which is saying that, you know, in an organization, everyone can be an agent of change. So everyone can try and push for change. It might not be the leadership who actually acknowledge that this is something that has to be done. It might be coming from within the organization at sort of lower levels. And so how can you, support and nurture an organizational change that might be more receptive to collecting equality data? It's a hard question, I'm sorry. Also, there's so much different perspectives and there's so many different organizations and sectors. But maybe some overarching thoughts maybe.
Yeah, so working, as I mentioned, the European Network Against Racism has a platform called Equal at Work, where we partner with the private sector on questions related to structural racism and integration and of diversity in the workplace. And we see that since last year and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and civil society in 2020 following the death of George Floyd, that companies have started to get an understanding, and if not an understanding, at least an awareness of the necessity to foster diverse workplaces, but not only diverse in the sense of gender, because we know that there were so many advancements in terms of gender equality regarding, for instance, pay gaps and lack of representation in decision-making positions of women, glass ceiling, and so on. But we see that there is the beginning of an understanding that this also needs to happen for racialized minorities and racialized diversity, because this is based, of course, on an interest for them, which is the fact that diverse workplaces perform better. They're more innovative, they have better performance, productivity, and representativity. And when linking that to the recruitment crisis that we're currently seeing in Europe, that people have difficulties retaining candidates. And how do you retain diverse candidates? It's through good D&I policies, which should be based on equality data to assess the discrimination in the first place.
And I think you just mentioned quite a few interesting things, which is that, this idea that, we've been collecting data on gender, and people are, coming to terms finally with the fact that there's, discrimination based on gender, and that there's an awareness growing that we need to identify discrimination against racialized minorities in Europe. I wonder, to sort of ask a different question, also another question asked by someone in the coming today. What comes first, equality data or a diversity and inclusion policy? And actually, I'll ask this to Deborah too. What do you think comes first? Should it, is it a chicken egg scenario, or do they come at the same time? Do you need to have the data to be able to make an effective diversity and inclusivity strategy? Over to you.
God, that's
Deborah. Sorry, thanks to whoever asked that question.
Yeah, thanks. Really. I would say the policy comes first, right? Because policy is about intent. And as I said before, if you're just collecting data and no one knows why, and you don't know what to do with it, then you're going to get yourself into a mess, especially if it's the first time you're doing it, and if it's something you're approaching tentatively with skepticism from others, and almost like a proof of concept conversation. So I would always say your policy would come first, because at least with a policy you've given some thought to the beginning, the middle, and the end. Why you're collecting it, what you're going to do with it, and then how you're going to use it, which are the 3 steps for me with data collection. And then the process of collecting data becomes slightly easier, because you can design your questionnaire You can think about who you need to engage. You can extend to stakeholders, and you are clearer in being able to articulate what it is you're trying to achieve, which makes it easier for people to engage and come on board and become ambassadors and advocates for the work that you're trying to do.
Super. Thank you for that. Magda, any contrasting thoughts? What do you think on this?
Well, I have to agree that I think policy comes from intent, and that it should be the first step, especially considering the fact that the racialized minorities and minorities in general are already in the workplace, they're already in the workforce, so there should be policies addressing that before we even get to collecting the data on the current status of their discriminations.
Yeah. So it brings us back to that legislative context that's around, and that there's probably guidance there already. And I think in the heritage sector, maybe it's that, again, people haven't necessarily felt that this is relevant to them. Out of around, sorry, Deborah.
Sorry, Nicole. Just, I mean, I guess, relevant. I mean, that sort of mandating people to collect data is quite tricky in some ways, and that's why legislative frameworks are. That's why legislation is good if you treat it as a framework, and if you contextualize it. I mean, around business and around survival and about what is your offer and who is your offer to, as opposed to it being, oh well, I've got to do this because somebody's written down and said to me that I've got to do this. Because if that's the way that you're thinking about it, that's the way it's going to be presented to people. And that's not really constructive in a space that is already operating at a deficit model approach. People already approach diversity as a deficit. So anything you can do to remove that stigma from it. And I know, I know the heritage communities it's a struggle, here in the UK, struggled immensely. But actually, I think if you look now compared to 8 years ago, when Dee and me were both at the Arts Council and doing the first work around heritage here and about museums here, and look at 8 years, roll forward 8 years to the work that they now are doing, and the difference it has made to collect data, to understand who works within the heritage sector, who the heritage sector represents, who visits heritage, and the implications of that. It's been, they've been on a massive journey, a steep learning curve. And what that's done, it's opened up opportunities for them to partner with other people, to think differently about their collections, and to get a better understanding of the skills required in order to facilitate maintaining heritage as a core part of the cultural offer within the UK. Yeah,
I think, Magda, probably you at least from my own side, understanding this journey of becoming more comfortable, becoming more skilled, knowing what you're going to do with the data, knowing how you're going to implement this. It's very much a journey, and I think I completely agree that something I find really important is that it's beyond this tick box exercise, that it's not just that you're mandated to do this, that you're doing this for a purpose, and that purpose is relevance. It's about social justice. It's you're driven by things that are more than just the legislation around you, which is super. Thank you for raising that. I completely forgot where I was going before, which is probably fine. So I thought maybe I'll move us on to the next. So we talked about sort of institutional change, becoming more receptive maybe to these issues. I've talked about the legislation around it, maybe the patchwork, that it's good to look at your own national level, see what others are doing, look at the resources which are available, maybe to think about the actual technical challenges about collecting sensitive data. And this is something in Europeana, we collect data as part of our impact work, and we collect data, for example, for all our events, people who are registering. We've felt we used to ask people to share their gender, for example, and we asked people what their age was to try and understand if we were in our network and our events, if we were attracting people who are maybe more experienced in their careers. We found different ways of asking those questions. We don't ask about gender, however, anymore. We ask about whether we can make people's experiences at our events better, if there are some accessibility requirements that we can help with. But we experienced some concern from people who were like, why are you asking these questions? This is hard. And then as a result, we sort of stopped asking the questions, and so we could make sure we had those conversations, that it was more clear, like you mentioned, Deborah, have those conversations about what we're doing with this and why we're collecting it, because I don't think we were open enough about what we were doing and why. And actually our work on diversity and inclusivity has really come on so much since we started doing this, the data collection actually. So we have a lot more that we can be doing, and we will be doing over the next year and probably years. But my question is about, from your side, what concerns have you experienced? What discomforts? What are the practicalities of data collection that that might bring about some challenges or something that people have to be aware of? Is that a clear question? Is it a hard question? Okay.
Who do you want to start?
Do you want to go first, Magda?
Sure.
Thank you.
So I'd say that from a policy perspective, I'll get to private organizations and businesses later on, but I would say from a policy perspective in the European Union, we see that there is a lack of cooperation from European member states. What I mean by that is that the European Commission has been an ally to civil society organization when it comes to collecting equality data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. For instance, it's in its European Action Plan Against Racism that was released last year. It acknowledged structural racism for the first time and raised that one of the key actions to take to assess the situation and to plan accordingly is to collect data. Therefore, this action plan put forward the necessity to deliver guidelines targeted at member states, because as I said, they're the one that are the main barrier to data collection in Europe on the collection of disaggregated data by race and ethnicity. And these guidelines were published early on in September. The second, I would say, challenge when it comes to state data collection is the use of proxy. The use of proxies, such as the name of a person, the citizenship, the country of birth, the language spoken at home, which are proxies we believe are imprecise categories that capture discrimination based on, that try to capture but fail to capture discriminations based on ethnic origin and religion, and that can actually exacerbate racist discriminations because they're not including, for instance, second, third, and fourth generation migrants. Racism is not only perpetrated by the country of origin, but it's based on racial biases, which proxies are not taking into consideration. And finally, proxies support the construction of racialized people as not belonging to Europe or as not being Europeans. So that's from the perspective of the policymaker. But now I would say from the private sector and for private institutions, there are two stages when it comes to the concern they have. I would say the first one is regarding the legal framework and GDPR, and this very pragmatic question being, will I get sued if I collect data? And secondly, resulting from that is the perception on the people who will be surveyed. What will my employees think about that? Will they think it's too intimate? Will they think it's a breach of their privacy? And usually the solutions for that is, as Deborah put it so well, is the participation of the people at all stages of the survey. So when you're developing the methodology, when you're analyzing the data, and education of the employer on the framework regarding GDPR, and also on how to include their workers in this data collection exercise.
Thank you so much. That was so comprehensive. The use of proxies, I think we could have a conversation on for about an hour alone. easily. Deborah, over to you. And then I'm going to, there's a question also in the chat. I'll come to that next, but Deborah, over to you.
I don't really have much to add.
That was an amazing answer. Not on my page.
I don't really have much to add. I mean, I guess the way we did it, and the way I do it, and the way I like to work is very much always querying and questioning why. You know, the word I use throughout the process is why. You know, why are you doing this? Why are you asking questions about, you know, anything? I mean, it's interesting to hear that, you know, what you talked about, Nicole, that you were asking questions about specific things and then people queried it. And because you didn't have an answer, you stopped and then went back. So
yeah, you have to reflect a bit more.
I would just say, yeah, exactly. I would just say, use the word why and reflect and continually reflect throughout the process, because it's, you know, as Magda said, there are so many different things that can impact and it affects what's going on. But if you're holding yourself to account, then that will help you help build confidence in other people for what you're doing, and in the purity is the wrong word, but in the authenticness and authenticity of the survey and of the data that comes out of the survey. And I would also say, give yourself time. You know, it wasn't till the year 3 that we really sort of started thinking about, you know, margins of error and the samples and the sample size, and questioning and querying whether or not it was a true representation of our industry. So the first 2 years we did some quality assurance work with external verifiers, but year 3 we were like, okay, let's bring someone in to do some margins of error work with us around, and some proper statistical work with us around the data. And all of it is about building confidence and making people comfortable with the idea that what you're doing isn't something that's going to have a negative impact on them, and isn't excluding any particular group, and isn't about you know, trying to manipulate a situation in favor of any one group at all.
Yeah. No, that's really like reflecting back on the process. You know, it's the idea that, okay, we're going to try and make change really fast and address these issues, but absolutely we find that it wasn't communicated properly. It didn't work properly. So hopefully that was definitely a learning to me, to all of us. And it's not something we've stopped with, but it's something we're moving forward with. There were also concerns. I didn't know enough about GDPR at the time. You know, I was also scared. And maybe coming back to GDPR, and also, but not necessarily. It's coming back to the idea that this data should, you know, sensitive data should be aggregated. It shouldn't be in the sense that people can be identified on an individual basis. But we had a question of, can equality data be published as an open data set?
Now, I'm about to find out. I'm about to find out. I'm about to do a course on data ethics.
Okay.
And about open data. And I think, I mean, don't forget, open data is a scale. So our data is open, but it is shared open data. So it is shared across our particular group. So our group has 9 data controllers in it. And each time somebody becomes a diamond broadcaster, they become a data controller as well. So so the data is shared across that group, but and then it's published in a particular format. But within that group, it is open data. But it's not open to the public. It's not open published data. It's open to a shared group. So I think if you think of open data as the scale, and at what point on the scale do you want it to be open, and what the implications and ramifications of that are. So because we are, you know, our group is, so what's interesting is we have broadcasters who are controllers. So the membership of the organization is 17. There are 7 of which are broadcasters. They are the only ones who have access to the open data sharing set. The rest of the membership do not have access to that data. So even within the membership, we have a tier where there are people that can have access to the data to see the pure data, and then other people just get the aggregated anonymized data as published, so that anyone else can see it. So it is, you know, the open data conversation is dear and close to my heart, because that's where I started with open data. And when I first started this job, I was like, yeah, we can get a CSV file, we can put it out there, people can do what they want with it, all this stuff. And then it was like, no, it's black box. You can't, no one can touch it. You can't see it. And if you even talk, it's a bit like Fight Club, you know, first rule about diamond data is you don't talk about diamond data. That's sort of where it started. And I've dragged people along into the space of, well, no, we can talk about it and we can actually share, and it's okay. You know, nothing's gonna crumble if we do this. But yeah, my dream is to get us bang out open data in the public domain. People can cross-cut it however they want to cross-cut it, and all sorts of stuff. That's my big dream.
Thank you. It's a big dream. It's an exciting dream. Magda, over to, do you have any thoughts on this question?
I don't know much about open data, to be completely transparent, but it reminded me of the work that UNIA in Belgium did. It's a public body on rights here in Belgium, and they gathered data that was currently available from different surveys that were done by public or private organization, and it's available on their website to access. However, I think it was anonymized before being made public.
I think in both of your responses, it flagged in my head the idea that when you are sharing data, also you do have to tell the people whose data you're collecting that this is likely to be shared and how, which comes back to what we've talked about earlier, which is this telling people what you're going to do, what's going to happen with their data, and this transparency. Super. Thank you for that question. Thank you to whoever asked it. That's an interesting one. And there's a question from Yolande in the Q&A, which was as follows. So when we, very quickly also, no, I'm not going to get distracted. So Yolande first. When we talk about working towards social justice and equity in our community events, so the Europeana community, one of the ways to lower the barrier to entry in our professional events would be to create scholarships where we extend funding to people from minoritized communities so that they can attend or present at a conference, for instance. When we think about how to implement this, we find ourselves having to explicitly ask people who would want to apply for such a scholarship to identify as coming from a specific oppressed or minoritized community. So doing this feels quite uncomfortable, having to ask people to prove they're underprivileged, for example. Is there any way to make this process easier or less jarring, or are scholarships not the way to go at all? Any thoughts? That's a difficult one, because it's like Deborah, you're saying, it's like you're it's so you're having to really put yourself on a plate to try and be part of an opportunity. How can you
yeah, it's, sorry to interrupt.
No.
It is okay. So first of all, what I would say, there isn't one way, right? There isn't one way, and one size does not fit all. And I think that is the first thing I would say. There are multiple ways to respond, and you can do them together, collectively, separately, individually, all together. You can throw everything in, or you can try one at a time and test the water and see how it works. So scholarships are a good idea. Bursaries are a good idea. First. Second, once again, you have to know why you're doing it. And so what questions are, it's a bit like a job description. When you write a job description and you say this is desirable and this is essential in terms of the skills you want or the experience that you want someone to do, the person specification, what is mandatory and what is stuff you'd like to have. So you think about what is mandatory that you need to know in order to make an informed decision about how you allocate scholarship and bursary places. So one of them is asking lots of questions about someone's personal sensitive data and demography. The other one is to say, okay, tell us why. Is to say, what would your presentation be? If you could present, what would your presentation be? So it's to form it into a part of the work and of the conference or the event that it is that you're doing. So and then actually you can then respond and go, actually, this is really nice, and this is really good, and this is really important. And then you can ask the question of somebody. Then you can ask a second question and go, you know, would, you know, if you know, do you need a bursary to present this paper? We like this paper. You know, would it be helpful if there was a bursary available for you, or a subsidised place? And again, it depends on the language. You can call it scholarship, you can call it a bursary, or you can call it subsidised space. Or you can say, we'll invite you as a panelist or a speaker, and then you don't have to pay for this. If you need support with transport, let us know. So there are just different ways of doing it. Instead of going, you know, you're from a minoritized group, you've got to tell me and justify that, and then I will decide whether or not I'm going to believe you and give you the opportunity that you say you need. So there are just different ways of doing it. It's around how you ask the question, when you ask it, and how you fold it into your process. Really, that would, you know, that's the way that I work. And sometimes I just state quite clearly, you know, if you want a bursary, apply for it. And everyone can apply for it, a bursary, you know, or I do it sometimes. If, you know, someone says to me, I said, look, I can't afford to fly, or I can afford to fly this much and I need this much to top up, or, you know, whatever you need. There are just different ways of doing it that don't make it feel like it's you know, that you're doing someone a favor.
Super, thank you so much. Magda, do you have any thoughts to add? And Yolan, let us know if you have any other comments on what Deborah and Magda are saying.
Yeah, Deborah put it so well. I don't have much to add. I'd just like to put an emphasis on two things. The first one being that when it comes to D&I measures, it should always be a case-by-case analysis, and there are no measures that are one-size-fits-all. There are no measures that will work in all workplaces and that will function everywhere. I think Deborah put it very well. And secondly, to go back to the fact that it should be a collaborative and participatory effort. For instance, if what I advise usually, and what the workplaces I work with try to implement, is to have affiliation groups in their workplaces that they go to for these type of issues. So for instance, someone in the workplace in the affiliation group will know of a civil society organization that works with youth and knows someone that could benefit from this scholarship. I wouldn't have to be explaining it because you're already working with the organization where you know that they're making an impact on the communities you're targeting.
Super. So that's a message from Yolanda to say insightful answers. Thank you both. Thanks Yolanda for that question. That raised some really interesting points as well. I'd like to invite everyone who's here. Also, you can continue to add questions in the Q&A or the chat. Hopefully we'll see them. And I had a message from Alexandra that asking Deborah and Magda if you could share the links to your projects that we can follow. Maybe we'll do those. We'll do that at the end to make sure that that's there and everyone can follow your work. Also, we'll send an email to everyone with a big list of resources and a summary of today, so you will not miss out. I thought so. We talked about, you know, challenges around collecting diversity data, and I thought maybe to ask a question. We lost Deborah. We lost you. You still there? Oh, video's off. Sorry. There you go. You're back.
Yeah, I'm here.
Super. No worries. Sorry, I wasn't sure if anyway. You're still here. That's good to check. It's about maybe coming back to something you mentioned, Magda, about people becoming more confident, or, you know, this progression of people becoming more confident with measuring gender, and then moving and then realizing the importance and becoming more aware of the importance of racialized minorities, for example. And I'm thinking on a, you know, in terms of Europeana's network and people feeling, okay, we want to do this, we want to do this. Do people have to start measuring everything all at once. We've talked about intersecting identities and intersecting how you identify being different groups. How would you, maybe like that very first step for people, how would they move forward? Would it be that they, you know, look at their National Equality Act and start measuring against those categories? How would you recommend that someone starts? Do they maybe start with gender, or do they maybe start with the racialized minorities in their country? Where should someone start? And Magda, I'll hand this over to you, because I think you've got a grasp of the complexity of the European patchwork. So I'll hand that over to you as a difficult one. Where to start?
Where to start? Considering we try at INAR to have an intersectional approach, which means, as you said it, that we look at all grounds of one's identity, whether it be gender, whether it be race or ethnicity, religion, sexual identity, sexual orientation, disability. Mm-hmm. So in a survey, census, or however you decide to collect data, to start with only one ground of diversity is already eliminating the idea that there is an intersectional approach and that people can identify to many different things. I'd say technically the first step to collect data would be to understand the legal framework and to have a collaborative effort between human rights experts, legal experts, statisticians, and data analysts. And going back to the participatory nature, I know that I mentioned this a lot, but it's really a principle that leads equality data collection. But it means that the people you want to collect data from should also be present in these roles of data analyst, legal expert, and statistician to eliminate all sorts of bias and discrimination that may be created throughout the methodology and process of collecting data. But we also noticed that when it comes to racialized minorities, this is a difficult exercise. This is due to the structural nature of racism, which means that racialized minority do not benefit from equal access to education and employment. So from the get-go, they're already not at the same equal level than the rest of the society. And this has an impact on the representation in decision-making and position so that they can fully participate in the collection of equality data.
Mm-hmm. That's a really, really good point. That we're addressing something that's really systemic and not something that can be changed overnight. And then I wondered, Deborah, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry.
Lost you again.
No, it's fine. It's just me and my fingers on my phone, because I'm on my phone and every time I try and do the microphone, anyway, whatever. You don't need to know. You don't need excuses. I'm just completely
you're here, that's what matters.
Today. I absolutely agree with Magda. Absolutely agree, and I think that is always the best place and a great place to start. I, however, am a radical, so I go for the complete other end of the scale, which is to go for the hardest, least represented group, the most difficult data to collect, and just go straight in. Now, the reason why I work like that is because if you can harness people around that, right, around the most difficult spaces to operate and be in, the rest of it looks really, really easy. And the rest of it becomes so much more achievable, so much quicker. Now, that's not to say that it's not grueling and soul destroying and just sort of spend all your time going, why am I doing this? But the work we're doing at the moment is around disability. It's incredibly challenging. And for 4.5 years, I've been saying to everyone, disability is really important in UK broadcasting. We have to think about it. It has to be top of the agenda. Everyone smiled and gone along with me for most of that period. And then this summer, something happened. We were able to show really show within the data that progress was incredibly slow, embarrassingly slow, that nothing had happened. People had made commitments to doing things. They hadn't done it. It was clear they hadn't done it because it wasn't showing through in the data. And that if we carried on at the rate we were going, we would never meet the target that we'd set. And we sponsored an event. And, since September, everybody around me has become a disability expert. And is telling me how important disability is in our industry. Whereas I've been going on about it for 4.5 years. But what that does mean is that now people are expediting the work that they're doing around disability, and it's front and center within the diversity conversation. And that's kind of what I wanted and needed to happen. At the same time, my members are, they are the BBC, they are Sky, Viacom, CBS, ITV. We've got Discovery Channel in there. We've got UK TV in there. We've got Channel 4. So we've got massive broadcasters who are conglomerates and who have been taken over by conglomerates, and constantly having the conversation with them and discussing with them and going back to them using, we're doing a theory of change process with them at the moment about the data collection project. Are we still asking the right questions? Are we all on the same page? We've got some new members that have come in. Is their understanding of what we're doing, our understanding of it is? Do we need to do some realignment work? So all of that, again, is stuff that we're doing within the process and within making sure that groups, especially as Magda said, that have been excluded from these spaces historically and are subjected to biases and discrimination and prejudices without knowledge, are included in that space. And one of those things is that I lead the organization. So one of the things I do is look for who's not in the room and look for whose voice is not heard. When I sit in the room and I'm the only one that looks like me in the room, or I'm the only one that sounds like me, or I'm the only one that hasn't experienced the way I've had, I know something's wrong. So when I go outside for people to do the assessments or to do contracting work or to do anything, I seek out people from those groups that are not represented, because the hope is that they will bring a different understanding to the conversation and debate. And it's not challenging the people in the room and saying you're wrong, but what it is doing is using it as an opportunity to constantly grow and to constantly ripple the work that we're doing and the work that they're doing, and cross-fertilizing environments. And I think that is the best I can do and the best I can offer for making sure that we do not maintain the same cycles or similar cycles that have been historically at the helm of this debate and conversation.
Thank you so much for that. So much is I have so many questions in my head, and I need to focus. We're not going to be around we're not going to be here for the rest of the day, for example, but we have a couple more questions which I'd really like to ask you about, which is around about the data itself, and the idea that statistics can tell us, and like Deborah, as you just said, if you didn't have that data this year, you would not have been able to make that point of you have done nothing, you have not made the change you said you committed to. If you didn't have the data, you wouldn't be able to do that. But to what extent do you also need those more qualitative experiences? Those, how do you capture, as well as having this, big, probably very vast open data set, or not open data sets, these vast data sets, how can you really balance that? That's very convenient data to work with. How do you balance that with, the lived experience of those changes that people are maybe experiencing that are coming through?
So what we've done from the very beginning of the disability work in particular, I went into research design, so I commissioned an academic to work alongside me. And they've been working alongside us from 2018. And the first thing they did was surveys. So they did qualitative interviews with the industry first, and then they did a survey with the disabled people in the industry. And then when we did the interim report, and that gave us the first lot of data alongside the Diamond data. So that gave us the qual and quant alongside each other so that we could build a program of interventions. And at the midpoint, which was this year, we then did we then used the survey data from disabled people and looked at the diamond data and said, okay, what changes happened? Because actually what we're doing are two things. We're looking at cultural change and we're looking at demographic change, right? So the cultural change, we then interviewed disabled people again and asked about their experiences. And it wasn't all negative. So what we tried to do was also then go, what would need to be in place for this for the changes to enable you to be able to work within the industry. So we offered some positives alongside that. And then we had a pure look at, so then that meant that we could have a dispassionate look at the data and go, we reflect back to our members and reflect back to the industry and the broadcasters, look, nothing's done. You've not done anything. And these are some of the people that have had experiences, and these are some of the things that you could put in place to avert those barriers continuing to be in place. So the two can, and for us, they do work side to side, and we do them at the same time, because it's really important. I mean, it's really important to understand the impact of your behavior on other people, positive and negative. So your inability to collect data and engage with the basic idea of a demographic has an impact on someone just as much as your ability to do that and your willingness to do that has an impact on someone. And that's how we've worked it. And again, the reports are always done by external academics. They're always contracted by independently. So we don't tell people what to write. They write what they see as academics and offer their insights, and we take it on the chin. And sometimes it's a fight and sometimes it's not.
Super, thank you so much. I'm going to come back. You mentioned working with an academic there to help you get that sort of breadth of experience and collect those perspectives. And we'll come back maybe before we finish to skills and like how to actually get the skills to feel confident in this area around this data collection. It's more you need to do your homework when you're collecting diversity data. So, but I wonder, Magda, do you have any thoughts also within sort of organizations that you've seen working with, maybe large ones or small ones, how they've been balancing this sort of qualitative versus quantitative data collection? Have you seen any good examples of what's worked? Like Deborah mentioned, for example. Is this something people are thinking about, the sort of more qualitative experience?
Absolutely. And here I'm going to get a bit into the nitty-gritty details of how to draft a survey on equality data and how to balance quantitative with humans' identity, most specifically about the categories ones decide to put on their survey. So the categories should be constantly evolving. Not that it doesn't mean that each year or each 5 years when you're gonna do your survey on your workplace, you should modify everything, but you should at least review the categories that you're using to make sure that they follow the changes in society, because categories as a sociological concept is supposed to be dynamic. Equality data is supposed to be dynamic and evolve with changing societal realities. So the statistics and the categories that you're putting in place should also reflect all these changes. We've seen that, for instance, with surveys regarding gender and sexual identity when it comes to the increasing awareness about LGBTIQ issues that have resulted in many other categories open for gender instead of the only male and female categories.
I think that's a really important point, that this is not just one survey you make and you live with for the rest of your life in your organization. You've done your job, but this is something that's a continual process. And coming back to those themes of this being a journey as well, that you might make mistakes and you'll find out why, and you'll try and make improvements. Deborah.
I was just going to, no, absolutely. And I was going to add on to that. I think there is a difference between collecting data within a business and collecting data as an industry, or collecting data as a continent, right? And I think some of the practice around qualitative data collection within an organization, for example, are things like staff networks, right? Employee engagement networks, which offer an opportunity for people from particular groups to come together, regardless of the role that they hold within the organization and the business, or where within the business they sit, and have a conversation and if possible, influence policy creation and determination of data collection within the business, which is sort of our version of that is having stakeholder group meetings and ensuring that people from all the stakeholders are represented and have an opportunity to discuss what we're thinking around doing and what we want to change. We're in the process at the moment of looking at changing our questionnaire, of changing our system. And that requires an enormous amount of consultation, which is really interesting because they're all bored and they're like, oh, can't we just do this? I'm like, no, we're going to go through this process, whether you like it or not, because everyone's voice has got to be heard in it. And that's just as important as, with the staff networks or with constantly querying and questioning, and also remembering that the reality of data collection has changed. The gender conversation has moved on exponentially in the last 3 years. So collecting binary gender data at this moment in time puts you on the back foot, not the front foot, in terms of equality and diversity data collection.
Super. Yeah. Thank you so much. I have so many more questions, but I'm going to ask 2 more. I'll also say to anyone listening, this is your last chance to share questions. Of course, you can follow up with Magda or Deborah afterwards. I hope that's okay. The organizational websites are there. I have one question, and this is actually specifically to Deborah, actually, because the reason when I was thinking about this event and about this conversation, how can we with heritage, how can we think about what's the connection between professionals and audiences? What's a connection between the people working, behind the scenes in the museums and the archives and the libraries and the galleries, and what you see in the museums, the exhibitions, the books, everything you see. And there was this idea that looking at broadcasting, it's the people behind the scenes who tell the stories, and that's where the connection is. So that the representation of your audiences is directly linked to who is working in and who's telling the stories. And so this was what I thought was a really important. I'm going to get to my question, but I'm just saying that was my parallel, that was my link. But for you then, what is have you seen the change? So, you've been working on a lot of, behind the scenes, like addressing, practices behind the scenes, like exclusionary practices behind the scenes in broadcasting. Are you seeing any effects already on what we see as audiences, on the big screen? Do you see a change coming through? You mentioned already earlier that there was some progress that's not happening, but are there areas where you can see progress in a short time frame?
I think the main area where there has been progress is absolutely on screen, and is that idea that if you haven't got to look too hard and too far to find a person of color or a black person or a disabled person and put them on screen, you haven't got to look too far or work too hard to do that. And I think that once that sinks into people's heads, that becomes something that they do. Not judgment as to whether that's good practice or bad practice or the way to do it is aside, because they started to think about it. And then once people start to think about it, they start to have conversations about it and start to engage with the content. So one of the things, for example, is when I came in 5 years ago, one of the first things I did was an awards ceremony. And it's still been put together before I started. So all I was doing was sort of, presenting the awards. And in the judging room, there was a show that I thought was really, really good, which was a Black History show. quiz, a Black history quiz on television, and they got a pilot for it, and then they weren't commissioned. It was like, oh, there's no audience for it, so we're not going to commission it. And it didn't win the prize that I thought it should have won for best entertainment show. Roll forwards last year, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, everyone's got the black boxes and the white lettering, and the same broadcaster went back to the people who commissioned that pilot, who made the pilot, and offered them a series. So they offered them, I mean, it was only 4 in the series, but they offered them a series, and that went out. And then they got a second series, and that's gone out. And now people are going, what the hell? This should be on television all the time, because it's a Black history quiz. It's fronted by a known actor. It's, you know, it's the opposite to everything you see. So there's only one white person on one of the panels every week. So it's just Black people. When I say Black, I mean Black, African American, Black British people. So Black diaspora. So it's not including Asian, Southeast Asian, Indian, or Pakistani or Bangladeshi. It is just about Black history, and that notion that Black history is 1 month gone out the window. That notion that people don't engage and don't want to engage gone out the window. That notion that nobody would, you know, it wouldn't do an audience. I mean, it got a dodgy slot on a Sunday night, and it's still got an audience, and it's still got traction on social media. And it's still got people thinking and talking about Black history, things they didn't know, people they'd never heard of before, and inquiring. And that's, you know, and as a result, it's nominated now for 5 entertainment awards, including the presenter. So it's suddenly elevated all of that stuff that 3 years ago, everyone was going, nah, nobody's interested in this. It's not worth it. So that is the biggest change that I've seen happen. And that is just because, you know, you've kept talking about something and going, there is product here, there is content here, there is talent here already that you've overlooked, and now now you have to justify your overlooking and your inability to commission them. So that would be the one thing that I think that stands out. There are probably other examples of that, but that's the one for me that stands out.
Thank you so much. That's a really, do you want to share the link to the show? I'm not sure if we can access it in your...
You probably can. It's an ITV show. Sorry, I didn't know. I'll try and share the link with you.
Super, that would be great. We get that thing sometimes whenever you try and access things in the UK, and it's like, oh, sorry, which is a shame. I just saw I'm going to ask my final question very soon, but I'm going to actually very quickly going to ask this question from Tyrina, which is, I'd like to ask if you can recommend other platforms like Silvermouse that ensure data integrity, security, and privacy standards.
There aren't any.
Oh, super, great, okay. Really, Magda?
That's why we are the world's first, because there isn't anyone else that does it. And it's incredibly challenging. The closest we have is in Australia, something called the Everyday Project, which is modelled on our Diamond system that was built, but they've just really, I literally got an email last night from SBS in Australia saying they're just about to start thinking about publishing their first set of data. But that was modelled on our system, but there isn't really anything else out there.
Magda, any thoughts? Anything you've come across? Maybe different. We're talking global here, so you're already mentioning Australia, Deborah. It's interesting to see what's out there.
I engage with the quality data mostly on the policy side, so this is really outside of my expertise.
No problem. So we still have some conversations. We need to pick this up in a later conversation. No problem at all. But yeah, I think the idea that, you know, data integrity, security, and privacy is something which does makes people wary about branching into this, about collecting more data. We see this in conversations we have around our impact work as well. So I'm going to move on to our final question, because we are coming up to the end. And my final question is about skills and finding, you know, this confidence, like I just mentioned, this confidence of moving into this, embracing this conversation. Deborah, like you say, thinking that maybe this conversation won't have a result right now. It might take some conversations behind the scene. It might take a massive social shift. It might take a lot of effort, a lot of work. What you know, how can people feel more confident? Where can people go for help? How can people, and it's like we talked about first steps, but you know, for people, where do you think, and what would you recommend for people to think about skills? Maybe bringing skills into the organization in the first step, like Deborah, you also mentioned that. Where should people start? Deborah, you've unmuted, so I'll hand over to you, and then Magda, I'll hand to you to close. Thank you.
I would start at the heart of what you're trying to achieve. Because one of the things about the project that I inherited was they started with good intent, and then it moved into fear. So the system was built on fear. That's why the security is incredibly tough, because it was built on people being exposed, on the idea of, and not the people who were giving their data over, but the broadcasters being exposed and being made to look stupid for thinking of a project like this. So I absolutely, within your organization, you will have legal people, or you will have people who are technical. So you know, we've just done a project with an organization recently, and we had people from marketing, technical, people who did other surveys, collections and data collection, as well as legal, as well as data ethics, and you know, the people who just had this idea about wanting to collect data. And that was the group, the small group that we worked with, people from across the business, all of whom in some way would be implicated in the project of collecting data, diversity data. And it was a small group of about 7 people, and we met with them every 6 weeks or so, and we took them through some workshops and did some other work with them. But that's the sort of thing, that's your small start, is a small group of people who have skills that you need, and hopefully a passion and interest in the area. But if they don't have that, they at least have the ability to see, to vision. They have the ability to vision what it is you want to achieve, and support you in creating something to make it work. Don't ever try and do it all yourself. It doesn't make any sense. And always, whenever you can, go to the top of the food chain in terms of who knows, who's doing it best, and then as well as that, go to the top of the food chain of who has never been engaged in this process before. And you will always, and then you will see, you'll find the balance. You'll have something to counter what is you know, traditional, so to make sure that what you're not doing, you're not replicating bad behaviors of the past. That would be my advice.
So don't do it alone, and get some voices in the room that you trust and you know that will bring value. Magda. Thank you, Deborah.
Internally, within the organization, the first step would be to establish the purpose behind the data collection, and to organize, per se, a working group, maybe, or to set up a group of people from different stakeholders in the company. So human rights, legal, data analysis, statistician, and so forth. But not only to focus on this internal aspect, but to go beyond and try to go to the people you're seeking data from and be representative. So it reminds me, for instance, of a project that was carried out in Germany by one of our ENAR members, actually, a civil society organization called Each One Teach One, for a project called Afro Census, where they surveyed people of African descent to share their realities, discrimination, experiences, and perspective. So also going beyond the organization, outside to civil society organizations, to your affiliation groups within your organization, to grasp the realities of the people you're trying to get data from.
Amazing. So it's just reinforcing this idea of getting people involved, that you're not doing this by yourself. And I think that's a really, the fact we're here is already showing that we don't have to do this ourselves, and that there are people there we can call on, and we can also learn together as we're going forward. So I think from my side, well, I'd like to say thank you to and to Magda. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's come along today and asked questions, and also just being here, being part of this conversation really, drives its importance for us. This is the start of the conversation, as I mentioned. I don't know where we go next, but we will be going somewhere. So don't worry, we're going somewhere. And we will also share some resources. Deborah, Magda, I'll ask you to share what you're going to share some links that are relevant for us, and we'll follow up with those by email as well. So I'd like to say thank you so much. If you have any more questions, you can get in touch with us. And yeah, any last words from Deborah, Magda?
I've popped the link to my organisation in the chat if anybody wants to click on it, and that's in there. I will send the link to Sorry I Didn't Know and a couple of other shows as well to you, Nicole, so that you can share with them.
They'll come by email.
But thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation, and it's nice to know it is happening in Europe, even though we are no longer a part of Europe, which is a whole other conversation. But
bring Brexit into this.
I'm not going to start that now at 2:29, or 3:29 in the afternoon. But yes, it's nice to see, and I would say that the Europeana, the playbook, has been really helpful for me, because the bit that we don't know yet is evaluation, right? So that's the bit that I'm looking at going, so that's been really good for me to sort of go, these are some of the ideas that we can look at and think about in terms of evaluating all of this and trying to sort of put it in an appropriate space. So thank you very much indeed for asking.
Super. Thank you so much. Magda.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'll share some resources from institutions and also the report that the European Network Against Racism has published on this issue, because we've been really vocal. And even some of our members, as I was mentioning, Each One Teach One, provide their resources to their census and to more institutionalized sources. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's been fantastic. Yeah, thank you. This will also, the recording will go on Europeana Pro, so then you'll be able to share it with anyone who you think should be listening as well. There's some thank yous coming in from our participants. Thank you so much, and take care, everyone. We're gonna close now. So take care and have a great afternoon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.